Cop humiliates black woman. Over ID moments later, she suspends his badge as the head of Homeland Security. On a crisp Tuesday morning at John F. Kennedy International Airport, a routine security check was about to ignite a shocking confrontation. Lines snaked around stanchions, and weary travelers held their boarding passes close. Among them stood a soft-spoken black woman, her gaze steady and composed. Little did anyone suspect that beneath her understated demeanor lay a powerful secret, and that she was on a mission far more critical than catching a flight. In mere moments, a single act of prejudice by a uniformed TSA officer would spark a chain of events that would bring a turbulent past to light and topple assumptions about who truly wields authority. Passengers jostled for space in the security line at John F. Kennedy International Airport, the hum of conversation mingling with the drone of announcements echoing across the terminal. Some fiddled with phone chargers, while others rummaged through bags for passports. Every few minutes, a voice crackled over the loudspeakers, reminding everyone to keep their ID and boarding pass ready. It was a typical weekday rush. Business travelers carrying laptops and coffee cups were eager to get through security quickly, while families grappled with strollers and anxious children. Amidst the bustle, a tall woman in a stylish yet discreet navy blue pantsuit seemed to blend into the background. Her braided hair was neatly pinned back, her posture upright yet unassuming. Anyone who took the time to notice her would sense her calm confidence, though they might guess she was simply another busy professional heading to an important meeting. That morning, as dawn had crept over New York City's horizon, this woman, whose name would soon reverberate across headlines, had arrived at the airport alone. She'd driven herself, preferring solitude before a daunting day's responsibilities. Most travelers didn't realize she was on a business trip that could affect national policy, nor could they fathom the massive weight on her shoulders. Though she was accustomed to traveling discreetly, she also knew the importance of upholding protocol. Even the head of Homeland Security wasn't exempt from standard TSA checks, and she was prepared to quietly comply. However, her plan to pass through without fanfare was about to collide with prejudice in a way she never imagined. A sense of unease tugged at her, though she'd learned to tune out the subtle tensions that often accompanied traveling while black. She'd done this dance countless times, prepared for scrutinizing looks or follow-up questions about her ID. She had never let them rattle her too deeply, training herself to brush it off and move on. But this morning would be different. The sudden snap of tension in the air was almost tangible. As she drew closer to the checkpoint, voices rose. An older man in a Hawaiian shirt was arguing loudly with a TSA officer about taking off his shoes. On the other side, a mother with 2 toddlers pleaded for leniency with the liquid limit for her baby formula. The air felt charged with stress, as if one spark could ignite a larger conflict. In the middle of it all, TSA officer Richard Patterson stood on a small raised platform, scanning each passenger's face and ID with clinical detachment. His features were stern, his temples slightly graying, but an arrogance played across his expression, almost as though he enjoyed his position of authority a bit too much. Some officers were mindful of the stressful nature of travel and tried to keep a calm, friendly demeanor. Not Patterson. He thrived on the power bestowed by his badge and uniform. The woman in the navy pantsuit paused to observe this officer, curious about his behavior. She couldn't help but notice how he focused with extra intensity on the passports of travelers with darker skin. Though no explicit words passed between them yet, she sensed the swirling tension that was soon to involve her, personally and profoundly. Richard Patterson had been a TSA officer for nearly 15 years. He joined the Transportation Security Administration after a brief stint in private security. In his earlier days, he'd been fueled by a genuine desire to protect, shaped by his father's legacy as a police officer. But somewhere along the line, the frustration of dealing with aggressive passengers, long hours, and bureaucratic oversight eroded his sense of duty into something darker. His early enthusiasm had mutated into resentment. He felt overlooked for promotions, convinced that less experienced colleagues unfairly leapfrogged him. The heavier his chip on the shoulder grew, the more he leaned on strict enforcement of TSA regulations to validate his authority. In some corners of the break room, they whispered that Patterson enjoyed picking on people, especially minorities. He rarely crossed a line so blatantly that it would get him fired, but he came close enough to raise eyebrows. That morning, Patterson had arrived at the airport in a foul mood. His alarm had rung late. He'd barely choked down a lukewarm cup of coffee before racing to catch the subway. He'd spilled that coffee all over his uniform, had to rush back to change, and then received a reprimand from his supervisor for clocking in tardy. Rage simmered in his gut, searching for a release. The airport's throng of travelers offered a convenient outlet. If he could flex some muscles, it would nurse his wounded ego. He began the shift aggressively. When someone asked politely if they could keep a small souvenir snow globe, he barked that it exceeded the liquid limit and threw it in the trash with unnecessary force. A flustered elderly man who was hard of hearing was scolded for not removing his belt quickly enough. One by one, Patterson singled out those he perceived as vulnerable, feeding his frustration. Over the years, Patterson's internal biases had taken root. He'd faced minimal accountability, thanks to an environment where stressed co-workers sometimes turned a blind eye to subtle acts of discrimination. Passengers rarely had the energy to file formal complaints. Most wanted only to get through security and catch their flights. So Patterson continued unabated, meeting only sporadic resistance. Even then, that resistance often led to tense random searches, conveniently justified as part of his duty. Behind Patterson's life at the airport lay personal struggles too. His wife had left him 5 years earlier, taking their daughter along. He owed back child support. He felt shackled by a job that seemed to get him nowhere. Over time, each disappointment made him harsher, more bitter, as though punishing the world could somehow bring him a sense of control. But he never realized how precarious his position truly was. One day, one passenger, and one glaring spotlight would be all it took to bring his illusions of power crashing down. That day, the day he decided to pick on the tall black woman in the navy pantsuit, was the day his entire life would change. The line inched forward, and the woman felt eyes boring into her. She presented her boarding pass first, along with a standard-issue government ID that only listed basic details. It didn't boast any flashy emblem of rank, no immediate announcement of her status within the Department of Homeland Security. She had always believed in leading by example. If everyday citizens had to endure these checks, so would she. Yet, the moment Officer Patterson looked at her ID, his eyebrows knit together in suspicion. His voice, heavily laced with condescension, cut through the air. "Ma'am, this ID doesn't look right," he said, flicking his gaze between her face and the small plastic card. "Is this some sort of special license?" "I don't see a state seal," she explained calmly. "It's a federal identification card, officer. It's valid for travel and was issued through what?" "Some agency," Patterson interrupted. "I need a valid driver's license or a passport." This could be anything. His manner was abrupt, his tone bristling with the type of hostility that sets everyone on edge. A few curious onlookers shuffled aside, unwilling to get tangled in the unfolding confrontation, but close enough to watch. The woman resisted the urge to snap back, choosing a polite yet firm approach. "I have the right to use this ID. It's a government-issued form of identification. May I speak to a supervisor if this is unclear?" Her question seemed to push Patterson's irritation to a new peak. Instead of checking with a supervisor or scanning the ID properly, he turned to the crowd and, in a voice that rang across the checkpoint, said, "Step aside, ma'am. We're going to do a more thorough check. This line is for travelers with valid identification only." The words sliced through the atmosphere with a cold efficiency that made the onlookers recoil. The woman felt her pulse quicken. This had happened to her before, though perhaps never so brazenly. She had been singled out countless times, but rarely had she been so openly humiliated. For a moment, she considered revealing her actual position, pulling the rank card she so rarely used. Yet her sense of composure held her back. It wasn't in her nature to start a scene or evoke her title as a weapon. She wanted to believe the system could work the right way, that there was a chain of command to follow, and that if she simply asked for a supervisor, the issue would resolve calmly. But Patterson wasn't giving her that chance. He gestured for a female TSA colleague to join them and then barked at the woman, "Remove your shoes, your belt, and step into the screening area. We'll see if we can verify your identity there." "That's entirely unnecessary," she responded, carefully controlling her voice. "If there's confusion, I'd prefer we handle it at the desk." By now, a few travelers were straining to catch snippets of the conversation. Patterson, chest puffed, fed on the attention. "Don't tell me how to do my job. This ID is not standard, and until I confirm your status, you'll do as I say." The woman inhaled deeply, fighting the urge to reveal her credentials right then and there. She had planned to maintain some anonymity during this travel, but Patterson's attitude pushed her closer to the edge. Swallowing her frustration, she followed him to a side area, uncertain whether to let the situation play out or halt it immediately with a single phone call. She decided to wait, to see if Patterson's superiors would intervene and correct his overreach. But Patterson had other ideas. The woman's name was Victoria Coleman. Though few people in line knew it, she was, in fact, the newly appointed head of Homeland Security, a role that encompassed leadership over agencies including TSA, Customs and Border Protection (CBP), the Coast Guard, and more. She had recently been confirmed by the Senate, following a lengthy nomination process that weighed her spotless record and long-standing commitment to public service. In taking the position, she vowed to maintain humility and transparency, recalling her own experiences growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit. From a young age, Victoria witnessed both the beauty and adversity of life in America. Her father worked long hours in a manufacturing plant, and her mother juggled 2 part-time jobs to keep the family afloat. Determined to rise above the obstacles, Victoria excelled in school, earning scholarships that led her to a career in public policy and national security. She climbed the ranks through a combination of diligence, intellect, and an unwavering sense of justice. Along the way, she'd endured her share of discrimination. Whether it was teachers doubting her abilities in advanced math classes or colleagues undermining her input at meetings, Victoria learned to navigate the subtle and sometimes outright disrespect. Instead of letting it embitter her, she used each incident as a reminder of the work that remained to ensure fairness in institutions responsible for protecting citizens. Her appointment as the head of Homeland Security was a historic moment. She was among the first black women to hold such a high office in a field long dominated by men. Balancing the intricacies of federal agencies, congressional oversight, and complex security threats was daunting, but she rose to the task with grace. Despite her impressive position, she tried to keep life normal whenever she could. That was why she had decided to pass through the airport checkpoint like any ordinary traveler, without an entourage or special escort. The eyes of countless security personnel around the country were on her, but she wanted to experience a typical passenger's journey firsthand. It would give her invaluable insights into TSA procedures. She believed leadership should be informed by personal observation, not just data reports. Yet as she stood in that side screening area, confronted by Officer Patterson's blatant hostility, old memories surfaced. She thought back to days of subtle policing in her childhood neighborhood, the time an officer had stopped her father for fitting the description of someone else. She recalled the fury and helplessness she'd felt, even as a child, not understanding why the world treated her community with such suspicion. Now, as an adult with power, she faced a choice: step on Patterson with the weight of her authority, or handle this quietly. Initially, her instinct was to follow due process. But what she witnessed was no mere misunderstanding of her ID. It was an expression of prejudice. She suspected Patterson was ignoring protocol for verifying federal IDs and instead jumping straight to punitive measures. Victoria watched the female officer approach her with a wand scanner, her gloved hands gesturing for her to spread her arms. The officer, whose name tag read Diaz, seemed reluctant but obeyed Patterson's orders. The scanner beeped half-heartedly, tracing around Victoria's ankles and waist. Though polite, Officer Diaz gave Victoria an apologetic look. It was as if she recognized something was off but felt powerless to contradict Patterson. The sting in Victoria's chest grew. She understood the complexities of workplace hierarchies, especially in the TSA. But that didn't diminish her sense of betrayal. This was precisely the kind of abuse she had vowed to reform. When the manual screening ended, Patterson reappeared, brandishing her ID. "I'm running a background check." "If everything's clear, you can go on your way," he said gruffly. "Until then, stay right here." Victoria inhaled, quietly assessing her options. If Patterson tried to escalate this further, she would reveal the truth about her position. But for now, she waited, giving him one last chance to do the right thing. The irony did not escape her. If Patterson had scanned that card properly in the system, it would show that Victoria Coleman was not just a valid traveler, but the top-ranking official overseeing the TSA itself. While Victoria stood off to the side, the crowd in the main security line began to grow uneasy. Whispers floated through the terminal about the woman with the questionable ID and the TSA officer acting tough. Only a handful of them had glimpsed enough to sense that something bigger was brewing. Meanwhile, Patterson was at the TSA podium, fiddling with the computer. He typed and retyped the ID information, frustration mounting with every keystroke. The system, ironically, should have recognized the federal credentials and flagged the ID as belonging to a high-security official. But Patterson was too caught up in his prideful crusade to properly access the right database. Instead, he found no entry in his usual search fields. A supervisor named Andrea Mills, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair, noticed Patterson's elevated stress. She was known for her level-headed approach and for running a tight ship on her watch. Mills stepped closer, peering over Patterson's shoulder. "Everything okay here?" she asked. "You seem upset," Patterson grunted. "I have a suspicious ID from a passenger. Doesn't match any of the usual credentials." "I'm checking every database, but I'm not finding a match." Mills frowned. "Let me see that ID." She examined it briefly. Though not intimately familiar with every variation of federal ID, she noticed official barcodes along the edges. "Have you scanned the barcodes properly?" Patterson shrugged, an irritable tick tugging at his jaw. "System's glitchy. I'll get it working." Mills offered a calm solution. "Try the advanced scanning module, or let me handle it. We have a procedure for verifying certain federal documents." But Patterson yanked the ID out of Mills's hand, ignoring her suggestion. "I'll take care of it." Mills didn't appreciate his dismissive tone, but she let it pass for the moment, stepping aside to observe. She watched as Patterson tried again, fumbling with the software. You sure it's the system and not the credentials? She probed, her voice neutral but concerned. It was uncharacteristic for Patterson to struggle this much with a simple verification. He usually commanded the software well enough. Finally, Patterson let out a frustrated huff, spinning around to address Victoria, who stood calmly a short distance away, flanked by Officer Diaz. Ma'am, if this ID is truly federal, you'd better provide additional documentation or an explanation. Right now, we can't verify it. It looks like you're misrepresenting yourself. A ripple of shock passed through Victoria. Misrepresenting herself? She had half a mind to reach for her phone, call the direct line to the DHS main office, and settle the matter in under 30 seconds. Yet she wanted Patterson to realize his mistake without her forcing it. She replied, her voice measured, "Officer, I assure you that ID is genuine." "I'm prepared to," Patterson cut her off loudly. "Prepared to do what? 'Cause more delays." He turned toward Mills. "I'm placing this woman in a holding area until we confirm her identity. She's interfering with airport operations." That statement caused Mills to step forward, alarmed. Typically, placing someone in a holding area was a significant escalation, reserved for those suspected of serious threats. "Richard," she said firmly, "we should just run the advance check. There's no reason to hold her if she's cooperating." But Patterson, riding the wave of his own bluster, refused to back down. He leveled a cold stare at Victoria. "You're coming with me." Now, up to that moment, Victoria had allowed the situation to play out, hoping reason would prevail. But Patterson's threatened detention crossed a line. Her posture stiffened. She glanced at Mills, who looked uneasy, and then to Officer Diaz, whose face pleaded for a peaceful resolution. Calmly, Victoria stepped forward and said, "Officer Patterson, if you won't follow your own verification protocol, then I must insist you contact your direct supervisor or the TSA Federal Security Director for this airport." "Is that so?" Patterson sneered. "And you know so much about how TSA works?" A pause lingered as Victoria met his glare. For the first time that morning, she allowed a hint of her official presence to seep into her voice. "Yes, officer, the first do." Her tone was quiet, but something about it made Patterson hesitate, if only for a second. Then he brushed off the momentary doubt. "I'm done talking." He reached for Victoria's arm to guide her toward a holding area, a clear violation of TSA protocol, since she wasn't resisting or posing a physical threat. Before his hand could tighten around her elbow, Victoria's voice rose firm, unyielding, and with an authority that made everyone freeze. "That's enough, Officer Patterson." Mills took a step forward, alarmed. Several passengers and other TSA staff turned their heads, uncertain of what was unfolding. Patterson, stunned by the sudden command, paused mid-action. Victoria drew a breath. "I understand you might question credentials you're unfamiliar with, but attempting to forcibly move a cooperative traveler isn't standard protocol. I'm giving you one more chance to verify my identification properly." Patterson's face reddened, the tension building like a coiled spring about to snap. "Or else what?" For an instant, Victoria weighed her next words. She wanted to preserve the chain of command, but Patterson's brazen disregard for procedure and respect had cornered her. The entire crowd felt the electricity in the air. Whatever she said next would change the course of the morning and, unbeknownst to Patterson, his entire career. Holding Patterson's gaze, Victoria produced a slim black folder from her carry-on. Within it lay a second piece of identification, one Patterson had ignored. She carefully opened the folder so that only Patterson, Mills, and Officer Diaz could see. The small ID card bore the seal of the Department of Homeland Security, accompanied by a concise line of text, "Secretary of Homeland Security." Mills's eyes widened. She recognized the official insignia immediately. Her face blanched as she read the name. "Oh my God," she whispered, stepping back in shock. Officer Diaz looked as though her heart had plummeted to her shoes. She'd never expected to come face to face with the top official who oversaw their entire agency. Patterson, however, initially saw only the DHS seal and the official stamp. His first reaction was denial. He refused to believe that the person he'd been berating could be such a high-ranking figure. "This must be a joke," he sputtered, but his voice quivered with uncertainty. I've seen official IDs before, and that's the real one," Mills murmured, her gaze darting from the ID to Victoria's face. She swallowed hard, then managed a more formal tone. "Madam Secretary, I'm so sorry for this mix-up. If you step over here, I can verify your credentials immediately in the advanced system." Her eyes flicked to Patterson. "We'll make sure everything is cleared up." The tension in the air grew thicker. Patterson went from red-faced anger to ashen disbelief. All at once, he understood that the woman whose ID he deemed suspicious was actually his ultimate superior in the federal chain of command. The silence that followed was painfully awkward, broken only by the hum of overhead fluorescent lights and the low murmur of passenger chatter in the distance. Victoria locked eyes with Patterson. "Officer Patterson, you have severely mishandled this situation. You disregarded standard verification protocol and escalated matters without cause. I'm disappointed to see such conduct from someone entrusted with public safety." She paused, letting her words sink in, watching the realization dawn on Patterson's face. "My staff will be in touch with your supervisors regarding this incident. For now, I'll ask you to step aside. I'll work directly with Miss Mills to finalize my check-in." Patterson wanted to protest, to defend himself, but his throat felt constricted. He knew any desperate attempt to rationalize his behavior would only worsen his predicament. So he stood there, speechless, as Mills took Victoria by the elbow, but this time gently, guiding her to the advanced system that Patterson had neglected to use. Within seconds, the ID beeped through, revealing a match that would have ended the entire scenario before it began if only Patterson had followed procedure. The onlookers watched with curiosity. None knew the full magnitude of what had just transpired, but they saw Patterson's stiff posture, his hollow eyes, and Victoria's composed demeanor. They sensed a tectonic shift behind the scenes, as if the entire power dynamic had reversed in an instant. Once Mills finished the verification, she returned the ID to Victoria with a respectful bow of her head. "Madam Secretary, you are of course free to proceed. Is there anything I can do to make up for this?" Her voice trembled with the knowledge that the highest official in her chain of command had just been humiliated on her watch. Victoria breathed out slowly, letting her pulse settle. "Thank you, Miss Mills, but I'll simply continue my journey. I do expect a formal report on this incident. I hope you'll cooperate fully with the internal review." "Yes, of course," Mills said, turning to Patterson. "Come with me." Patterson mustered a feeble nod, his pride in tatters. He trailed behind Mills, shooting Victoria one last conflicted glance. Moments earlier, he'd loomed over her, brandishing power that now revealed itself as merely borrowed. Stripped of his confidence, Patterson walked away, utterly unsure of his future. Victoria gathered her bag and shoes, slipping back into her businesslike composure even as her mind whirled. She could already see the headlines that might emerge if word of this incident leaked to the press. As Secretary of Homeland Security, whose portfolio included oversight of TSA, she'd been humiliated in a public setting. And while she never sought to throw her weight around, this moment could hardly be brushed aside. She passed through the checkpoint and emerged into the concourse, where travelers hurried to gates and browsed newsstands. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket. She found a quiet corner near a row of seats and answered the first call. "Victoria," came the anxious voice of her chief aide, Samuel Park. "We got an alert from the advanced ID system that you triggered a manual verification at JFK. Is everything all right? Victoria managed a weary smile. I'll explain it all soon. Let's just say I was singled out by an overzealous TSA officer. She heard Samuel sigh. I'll prepare a preliminary incident report. Are you okay? Do we need a security detail sent in? Victoria glanced around. The swirling chaos of the airport felt almost surreal after the confrontation. She'd faced far bigger threats in her career: cybersecurity risks, international terror plots, but never had she been so abruptly put on the defensive by someone within her own agency. I'm fine, she reassured him. No need for a security detail, I just need to collect my thoughts. After hanging up, she took a few deep breaths, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. She considered the magnitude of Patterson's transgression. While she believed in second chances, there was no denying that his actions reflected a deeper institutional problem. She had spent much of her career trying to build a culture of respect and accountability. Incidents like this highlighted just how much further they needed to go. Meanwhile, back near the security checkpoint, Patterson stood with Mills in a small administrative office. The mood was grim. Mills typed rapidly on a computer, filling out an initial complaint form. Patterson hovered by the door, hands fidgeting, his mind spinning in panic. He wanted to say something, explain, apologize, or justify his actions, but he couldn't find the right words. Finally, Mills spoke without turning her head. You do realize who that was, right? Patterson swallowed. Yes, I had no idea. Mills shook her head. There's no excuse for how you handled that. You refused to follow procedure, singled her out, and ignored me when I tried to help. This isn't a matter of her position. It's about your conduct toward any passenger. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His mind danced between regret and anger, frustration at how quickly his day had unraveled, and the deeper sense of guilt that perhaps he'd always known his behavior would catch up to him. I thought she was forging a federal ID, he finally managed. Mills turned to face him, arms crossed. That's not what the system indicated. You never bothered to use the advanced checks. If you had, you'd have seen everything was in order. Instead, you escalated for no reason, right in front of everyone. Patterson ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of consequences. What happens now? Mills sighed. I have to file this up the chain. She asked for a formal report. There'll be an internal investigation, likely from DHS. At best, you'll face suspension. At worst, you could lose your job. She hesitated. I've seen you push boundaries before, but nothing like this. Those words felt like a punch to Patterson's gut. Suddenly, losing the job he'd once resented felt terrifying. Without it, he had no livelihood, no way to pay child support, no stable ground. And it was all because he couldn't swallow his pride and follow procedure. In that moment, he realized the fragility of power. Authority, he understood too late, wasn't a license to dominate, it was a responsibility. The authority he'd wielded over others had just been stripped away by a single revelation. He thought about the brief flash of steel in Victoria's eyes, how she'd commanded respect with a single sentence. He knew that look. It was genuine leadership. In contrast, his power now felt embarrassingly hollow. Before Mills could say more, the phone on her desk rang. She answered, speaking quietly, then hung up and fixed Patterson with a serious expression. That was the office of the Federal Security Director. She wants to see you immediately. Patterson's heart hammered. What do I tell her? Mills locked her gaze on him. The truth. It's the only chance you have left. Half an hour later, Patterson found himself in the Federal Security Director's FSD office on the upper floors of Terminal 4. The waiting area was small and sterile, with plain walls and minimal decoration, and intentional setting that conveyed the gravity of official business. Patterson sat stiffly on a wooden chair, running through the script he had tried to rehearse in his head. He'd never met the FSD in person, though he knew of her formidable reputation. Her name was Deirdre Lawson, a veteran of airport security who had overseen safety operations in some of the busiest air travel hubs in the country. She was rumored to have little tolerance for unprofessional conduct. Eventually, an administrative assistant led Patterson into Lawson's office. The moment he walked in, he noticed a large window overlooking the tarmac, where planes taxied and ground crews bustled about. Lawson stood by that window, arms folded behind her back. She wore a crisp black blazer, and though she was of average height, her presence filled the room. "Officer Patterson," she said, not turning around, "please close the door and sit." He did as told, his heart pounding so loudly he feared she might hear it. Lawson turned to face him at last, her features impassive. "I've read the preliminary incident report." She paused, picking up a file from her desk. "You were involved in a confrontation with the Secretary of Homeland Security." Patterson swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am." She raised an eyebrow. "In all my years here, I've never encountered a scenario quite like this. So, let's get straight to the point. According to the report, you questioned the validity of the Secretary's ID, refused standard verification protocols, escalated the situation, and attempted to detain her without probable cause. Is that correct?" Humiliation mingled with fear. He resisted the urge to look at his shoes. "Ma'am, yes, that's essentially correct, but I thought I was following protocol." Lawson narrowed her eyes. "Really? Because according to Miss Mills and the documented procedures, you bypassed multiple steps of verification and dismissed offers of assistance from your supervisor. Why?" Caught between shame and desperation, Patterson tried to salvage himself. "I was under a lot of stress. The line was busy. I wanted to ensure security. When the ID didn't show up in my usual checks, I grew suspicious. Suspicious enough to ignore standard procedure?" Lawson pressed. "Suspicious enough to place a cooperating passenger in a holding area?" He opened his mouth, but words failed him. He heard his own excuses echoing hollowly in his mind. "I understand now that I made a mistake. Mistake is putting it mildly," Lawson replied, dropping the file onto her desk. "You should know that the Secretary has requested a full internal review. She wants to see if this was just one isolated event or part of a broader pattern." A cold sweat broke out on Patterson's brow. He knew what a broader pattern implied. They'd scrutinize his entire service record, look at any past complaints or informal warnings. And he had more than a few. "With all due respect, ma'am, I try to serve well. Maybe I was too quick to judge this time. But I didn't mean any disrespect to the Secretary or the agency." Lawson studied him, her gaze penetrating. "I've seen the logs. You've had multiple passenger complaints, though none as high profile. Perhaps none gained traction because you usually found ways to justify it. But this time, there's no covering up. The Secretary, with her legal and administrative powers, witnessed it firsthand." She exhaled, her tone shifting from punitive to somewhat resigned. "Officer Patterson, I don't relish terminating anyone's career. We're all here to protect the flying public. But if you cannot treat travelers with dignity, especially those who fully comply with procedures, I question your fitness for this job." He felt the finality in her words. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, voice trembling at the edges. Lawson tapped a pen on her desk. "Until the investigation concludes, you're suspended from active duty without pay. If the review confirms this pattern of misconduct, your employment with TSA will be terminated. You might also face additional disciplinary measures, depending on the Secretary's directives." A heavy silence fell. Patterson thought of his bills, his daughter, the life he'd built around his TSA career, even if it was a shaky foundation. This was the day he'd always dreaded, the day his behavior caught up to him in a way he couldn't talk or bully his way out of. Lawson glanced at her computer screen. You should return your badge and any other government-issued materials. Someone will escort you out of the facility. Further instructions will be sent to your address. A lump formed in Patterson's throat. He rose on unsteady feet, removing his TSA badge and handing it to Lawson. The small piece of metal, once a symbol of authority, now felt like a lead weight in his hand. Lawson took it, placing it in a small box on her desk. Without another word, Patterson turned to leave. Before he reached the door, Lawson called after him, "I truly hope you reflect on this. Perhaps it's a chance to correct course, though it might be too late for a second chance at TSA." He nodded numbly and walked out. In the corridor, a security officer waited to escort him to collect his belongings and leave the terminal. As Patterson followed in silence, he couldn't help but replay the morning's events in his mind. His arrogance, his refusal to adapt, his immediate resort to hostility, all culminating in a humiliating suspension, and he knew the worst was yet to come. Victoria's flight touched down in Washington, D.C. later that afternoon. The moment she powered on her phone, it buzzed non-stop with calls, messages, and notifications. She slipped into a discreet airport lounge area to catch her breath and address the mounting firestorm. Samuel Park, her chief aide, had left several urgent voicemails. She called him back. "Samuel, I'm here. What's happening now?" "Madam Secretary," he said breathlessly, "the news is out. Someone at JFK must have tipped off a local journalist. There are rumors swirling that you were harassed by a TSA officer, and it's all over social media. Some even have partial video clips from other passengers' cell phones." Victoria let out a slow sigh. She had anticipated that the story could leak, but not so quickly. "All right. Let's stay calm. What's the current narrative?" "Well," Samuel replied, "headlines are sensational. TSA officer humiliates Homeland Security chief at JFK Airport. They're missing details, so speculation is rampant. Some outlets are highlighting possible racial bias. Others are focusing on TSA incompetence or on how you tried to travel incognito. Overall, it's a huge story, bigger than I expected." Victoria felt a twinge of disappointment. She had wanted to keep the incident quieter, preferring to deal with Patterson internally. But the public appetite for drama was strong, and the event had all the makings of a scandal, race, authority, travel chaos, and a confrontation with a senior government official. "What's our official statement?" she asked. Samuel hesitated. "We drafted one acknowledging the incident, but emphasizing that an internal review is underway. We also stressed your commitment to fairness and accountability across DHS. However, we need your sign-off before releasing it. Some advisors think you should hold a press conference to address it personally." Victoria considered the options. Her style as a leader was transparent and proactive, but this was a tricky situation. She didn't want to publicly crucify Patterson before the investigation concluded. On the other hand, ignoring the story or issuing a vague statement could fuel further speculation. "Schedule a brief conference for tomorrow morning," she decided. "I'll address the basics, reaffirm policy, and keep the focus on improving processes. Let's not demonize the entire TSA workforce for one person's actions." "Yes, ma'am," Samuel said, relief coloring his voice. "We'll arrange it." Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in Queens, Officer Patterson sat on his couch, numb. His phone had been buzzing incessantly, texts from co-workers, missed calls from unknown numbers, likely reporters. He couldn't bear to answer. He switched the phone to silent mode, staring blankly at the small TV in his living room. The local news channel ran a teaser for the story. Coming up next, shocking behavior by a TSA officer at JFK directed at none other than the Secretary of Homeland Security. His stomach twisted. He'd never felt so exposed or vilified. Memories of his old arrogance swelled within him, now painted with regret. Every bully tactic, every smug comment, every mischance at empathy replayed in his mind. He realized just how deep a hole he dug. Even if, by some miracle, the investigation spared him from complete job termination, he would be infamous in the eyes of the public. His neighbors might recognize his face on TV. Former friends or classmates might see him as a symbol of racism or abuse of power. He gulped down the sour taste in his throat, despair creeping in. By late evening, the media storm had fully erupted. Cable news pundits debated the significance of the incident. Some said it underscored a systemic problem within the TSA, while others questioned whether Victoria Coleman had tested the system intentionally by using discreet travel methods. Social media lit up with hashtags about the fiasco, some criticizing Patterson's alleged racial bias, others calling for sweeping TSA reforms. For her part, Victoria tried to maintain composure. She recognized the bigger picture. One humiliating encounter could catalyze necessary reforms, shining a light on how minority travelers were sometimes treated. Yet she felt a personal sting. She'd always hoped to see change happen through steady leadership and policy, not through a viral scandal that broadcast her own humiliation to the world. But the genie was out of the bottle, and the next day's press conference loomed large. As the news cycle churned, local reporters dug deeper into Patterson's history. After all, controversies involving potential prejudice often drew intense scrutiny. A journalist from the New York Daily Bulletin found old court records detailing Patterson's custody battle for his daughter and the contentious divorce that left him strained financially. Another reporter uncovered social media posts from years ago, posts that weren't overtly hateful but contained subtle undertones, suggesting a resentment towards certain groups. When those posts began circulating on Twitter, the public's perception of Patterson worsened. Some labeled him a bigot. Others argued that personal struggles shouldn't excuse professional misconduct, but might explain the anger behind his actions. In any case, Patterson's name trended in a way he never imagined possible. At his apartment, Patterson received a text from an old army buddy, the only friend he felt he could still trust. The message read, "Dude, I'm so sorry this happened. If you need a place to crash or just want to talk, I'm here, but you should lay low for a while." Patterson stared at the screen. His impulse was to lash out, to claim he was misunderstood, but exhaustion weighed down his heart. Over the next few days, he hardly left his couch, surviving on instant ramen and half-empty beer cans. He avoided calls, including those from union representatives who wanted to discuss his case. The swirl of media coverage painted him in an almost demonic light, and he couldn't bear to face it. Meanwhile, behind DHS's closed doors, the official investigation advanced. Victoria's second-tier deputies formed a panel to review Patterson's record, examine surveillance footage, analyze passenger complaints, and interview relevant witnesses. The deeper they looked, the more patterns they unearthed. One colleague recounted how Patterson had lost his temper with a passenger in a wheelchair. Another described how Patterson selectively subjected women of color to more aggressive searches. Though no single incident had reached the level of official disciplinary action before, the aggregate told a disturbing story. Each data point painted Patterson's meltdown with Victoria as less of an anomaly and more of an inevitable climax to a years-long pattern of misconduct. Victoria received periodic updates on the inquiry. She held back from influencing the process, wanting to preserve the panel's objectivity. She had her opinions, of course, but believed in letting the system function independently. Still, every new piece of evidence confirmed her suspicion. Patterson had not merely slipped up once. He had a long history of weaponizing his badge against those he perceived as lesser. As she prepared to address the public at the press conference, She jotted down notes on reform measures she intended to propose. Despite the personal sting, she wanted to shift the conversation from the sensational incident to something constructive. This was her chance to push forward deeper cultural and procedural changes within TSA-1s that could outlast her tenure. And, ironically, Patterson's misconduct might be the catalyst that spurred the institution to evolve. Morning light spilled into a conference room in downtown DC, where Victoria met with a group of senior officials representatives from TSA's leadership, legal counsel, and White House liaisons. They were gathered to discuss the fallout of the incident and plan next steps. Seated at the head of the table, Victoria began, "First, I want to assure you this situation won't turn into a witch hunt. We have a thorough investigation underway. If the findings confirm Officer Patterson's pattern of misconduct, he will be disciplined accordingly. But that alone doesn't solve the larger issue." A younger official from the White House Domestic Policy Council leaned forward. "Madam Secretary, the President is concerned about the negative press. We're dealing with a sensitive climate. We want to avoid the narrative that TSA harbors systemic bias." Victoria nodded. "I understand. However, ignoring or downplaying a problem only fuels mistrust. We must address it head-on. The public is tired of superficial statements. They want tangible reforms." She paused, scanning the room. "I propose a new training regimen focusing on de-escalation and implicit bias awareness for all TSA officers." The TSA administrator, a man named Colin West, cleared his throat. "We already have training modules on that. We do. The question is, do we need to revamp them entirely or enforce them more rigorously?" "Both," Victoria replied. "We need more rigorous enforcement and oversight, and we must ensure supervisors can't simply cover for subordinates who repeatedly violate policy." In the Patterson case, we found multiple missed opportunities where earlier interventions could have been made. A legal counsel representative spoke up. "What about Patterson's due process? If we accelerate changes while this is ongoing, we might face legal challenges. We can handle that carefully," Victoria said. "The reforms aren't about one individual. They're about ensuring that no future Patterson scenario happens again. Our approach won't be reactionary. It'll be structured, with stakeholder input." The room sat in thoughtful silence. It was no small undertaking to shift the culture within an agency as large and complex as the TSA. But the assembled officials recognized the necessity. The press was hot on the story, and the public demanded accountability and improvement. "We'll finalize a statement for your press conference," West said. "You'll emphasize transparency, the investigation, and upcoming reforms." Victoria agreed. "Precisely. I also want to highlight that the majority of TSA officers conduct themselves professionally. But we must root out those who abuse their power." The meeting concluded with a sense of determination, albeit tempered by the knowledge that true change would take time. For Victoria, it was a chance to prove her leadership in a crisis. For the White House, it was about managing a volatile media narrative. For the TSA, it was an opportunity to reflect on its own weaknesses and implement overdue corrections. As Victoria left the conference room, she glanced at her watch. Her press conference was in 2 hours. She rehearsed her talking points, steeling herself for the inevitable barrage of questions. Though the next steps were daunting, a calm resolve filled her. This was the very work she had signed up for when she accepted her appointment, ensuring national security while preserving the core values of justice and respect. Despite the swirl of negative attention, not everyone relished Patterson's downfall. Some of his fellow officers, even those who disliked his methods, pitied him. Life was complicated. People made bad decisions for complicated reasons, and Patterson had certainly dug himself into a deep hole. Late one evening, as Patterson sat in his dimly lit apartment, he received an unexpected visitor, his old friend, Marcus. They had been best friends in high school, then joined the army at different times. Marcus went on to become a social worker after his service, dedicating himself to helping at-risk individuals. Patterson opened the door, eyes bloodshot. "Marcus, you shouldn't be here," he muttered. "The press is outside sometimes." Marcus shrugged, stepping in and setting down a paper bag of groceries. "Let them see me. I'm not ashamed to be your friend." He glanced around the cluttered living room. "I heard you were holed up in here. Figured you might need something to eat." Patterson looked at the bag. Inside were fresh produce, bread, and a few microwavable meals. "Thanks," he whispered, voice cracking. He gestured for Marcus to sit on the couch. They talked in low voices. Patterson recounted the incident for the umpteenth time, though this time with a little more introspection. He admitted he felt cornered that morning, humiliated by small failures in his life, and that he saw the woman's ID as a personal challenge, rather than a routine check. Marcus listened patiently. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it," Marcus finally said. "What you did was wrong, but I know you're not beyond redemption. The question is, do you want to fix this? Or do you want to keep blaming everyone else?" Patterson sighed. "I spent so long feeling powerless. That badge was the only thing that made me feel in control. Now I see how twisted that is. I guess this is karma, right?" Marcus placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Karma can be a teacher, but whether it breaks you or shapes you is up to you." Those words lingered. Patterson realized that for all the external chaos, the biggest battle lay within himself. If he truly wanted to change, he had to confront the bitterness he'd carried for years. He had to own up to his failings. One small gesture was enough to begin that process. Patterson emailed a formal letter of apology to the TSA, addressing it to Secretary Victoria Coleman. He didn't expect leniency or a second chance, but he believed an apology was the least he could offer. He admitted to mishandling the situation, to letting personal biases cloud his judgment. He expressed regret for tarnishing the TSA's image and vowed to seek professional help to address his anger and prejudice. He didn't know if Victoria would read it or accept it. Still, as he pressed send, he felt a faint sense of relief, as though a heavy load had slightly lifted. Whatever fate awaited him, he wanted to move forward without the bitterness that had dogged him for years. Late one evening, as Richard Patterson sat in his dimly lit apartment, he received an unexpected visitor, his old friend, Marcus, who brought a small bag of groceries and a willingness to listen. The silence in the apartment spoke volumes about Patterson's despair. He had avoided the media, his former colleagues, and even the calls from the TSA union. Hesitantly, he recounted his humiliation at John F. Kennedy International Airport, describing the anger and frustration that had boiled over when he confronted Secretary Victoria Coleman. Marcus, now a social worker, reminded him that his badge had never granted him the right to degrade others. Only by facing his biases could Patterson even begin to make amends. That night, Patterson composed a letter of apology to Secretary Coleman. It was raw and disjointed, yet undeniably sincere. He confessed his guilt, recognized how his prejudice had clouded his judgment, and expressed regret for tarnishing the TSA's reputation. While he knew an apology wouldn't magically erase the harm done, he hoped it might serve as the first step toward genuine personal change. Soon afterward, the TSA investigation concluded, confirming Patterson's pattern of misconduct. He was officially terminated. Stripped of the badge he had once wielded as a source of hollow power, Patterson took a low-paying warehouse job, determined to pay his debts and rebuild a life based on humility rather than anger. Though unsure of the future, he clung to the hope that confronting his past would free him from the bitterness that had wrecked his career. Several weeks later, Victoria Coleman revisited JFK Airport to observe how her new directives were being implemented. She noted subtle changes. Officers treated passengers with more respect, and supervisors insisted on following updated verification procedures. Through collaboration with TSA leadership, she had rolled out additional training on de-escalation, implicit bias, and accountability, aiming to ensure that no traveler would experience what she had. Before departing the airport, she met Supervisor Mills, who handed her Patterson's letter. Reading it in her car, Victoria sensed real regret. Though no apology could undo the public humiliation, Patterson's willingness to own his mistakes held some promise. In the months that followed, she continued her push for deeper reforms across the entire Department of Homeland Security, urging a culture of empathy and professionalism within all frontline agencies. The fiasco that had erupted around one officer's abuse of authority became a catalyst for wider change. Patterson's downfall, though painful, served as a stark reminder that the trust placed in uniformed personnel could vanish if they weaponized their power. Meanwhile, Victoria's leadership approach, mixing firm accountability with measured compassion, helped restore faith in an institution many had begun to doubt. Ultimately, the turbulence at JFK marked not just the end of one officer's career, but the beginning of a renewed commitment to protect the traveling public with both vigilance and respect. Thank you for watching this dramatic journey of revelation, redemption, and reform. The next time you're in line at airport security, remember how a single encounter at John F. Kennedy International Airport sparked profound changes across an entire agency. It's a reminder that we all have the power to stand up to discrimination and push for accountability even when the odds seem stacked. If this story inspired you or opened your eyes to the impact of everyday actions, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that shine a light on hidden truths, celebrate courage, and encourage us all to do better. Let's keep learning from these moments and striving to create a more equitable world for everyone. Thank you, and we'll see you in our next story. Safe travels.